Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're tackling a topic that affects really a significant number of individuals worldwide, endometriosis.
hmm
We've gathered a stack of research to really unpack what it is and, importantly, how diet and nutrition might play a role in managing it.
And just before we jump in, a quick but really crucial reminder for everyone listening.
Please.
The content in this deep dive is purely for informational purposes. It's not intended as medical diagnosis, treatment, or advice. Please, always consult a healthcare professional for any health-related concerns.
Absolutely essential. Okay, so you shared some fascinating material with us, including a really comprehensive review article from Nutrients looking specifically at dietary and nutritional interventions.
That's right.
So our mission today is to dive into these sources, pull out the key insights, and focus on how diet and nutrition sort of intersect with this really complex condition. Okay, let's get into it. What exactly is endometriosis in, simple terms?
Right. So think of it like this. Normally, the tissue lining your uterus, that's the endometrium, it's only supposed to be inside the uterus. With
Okay.
endometriosis, tissue that's actually very similar to that lining
Right.
starts growing outside the uterus, and that's where the problems start, causing inflammation.
Inflammation. Got it. And it's pretty common, right?
It is surprisingly widespread. Globally, we're talking about roughly 190 million girls and women. That's around 10% of those in their reproductive years.
10%. Wow.
Yeah. And what's interesting, too, is that it can also affect a notable percentage of women experiencing infertility and even perimenopausal women.
Perimenopausal women, too. I hadn't really connected that. That suggests it doesn't just, disappear after the main reproductive years.
Exactly. It can definitely persist or sometimes even first present
Right.
in perimenopause. We're looking at maybe 2 to 4% of women in that stage. And it's not just one single thing either. It can show up in different ways.
Right. The review mentioned different types.
It breaks it down a bit. The most common is probably superficial endometriosis. That's small lesions kind of on the surface lining of the pelvic cavity.
Okay.
Then you have ovarian endometriosis. This is where cysts, sometimes called endometriomas or chocolate cysts, form on the ovaries.
Right. I've heard of those.
And then there's deep infiltrating endometriosis, or DIE. This type, as the name suggests, grows quite deeply, like 5 millimeters or more beneath the peritoneum, which is the lining of your abdominal cavity.
That sounds quite invasive.
It can be. And here's something that, well, it surprised me too when reading through the sources where else it can pop up.
Oh, outside the pelvis.
Yes, exactly. While it's less common, this endometrial-like tissue can actually be found in various other organs.
Yeah.
The intestines, the bladder, the diaphragm.
The diaphragm, the breathing muscle.
Yep, even the thoracic wall, the abdominal wall, and in really rare cases, the central and peripheral nervous systems. It just shows how diverse this condition can be.
Wow. It really can show up in unexpected places. And I'm guessing the symptoms are just as varied from person to person.
Absolutely. Highly variable, not just between different people, but even for the same person over time. And that variability, unfortunately, contributes to the often lengthy and challenging journey just to get a diagnosis.
So what are the common ones people experience?
Well, pelvic pain is a big one, obviously, but also really painful periods. The clinical term is dysmenorrhea.
Mhm.
Then there's painful intercourse, dyspareunia, painful bowel movements, that's dyschezia, and painful urination, dysuria.
Okay, so pain seems central.
Very much so.
Mm.
But beyond those more localized pelvic symptoms, fatigue is huge. Feelings of depression are common too, and very often IBS-like symptoms.
IBS, like bloating and...
Yeah, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, just general abdominal discomforts, really broad range, which, as you said, likely resonates with many people listening who are navigating this.
It really sounds like a lot of those symptoms could overlap with other conditions, making it even tougher to figure out what's going on.
That's a really crucial point. There's significant overlap, especially with irritable bowel syndrome, IBS.
Right.
Studies suggest IBS is maybe 2 to 3 times more common in individuals with endometriosis. There's also an increased risk of inflammatory bowel disease, IBD, in this group.
So how do you differentiate?
Well, pain is a key overlapping symptom, and one potential mechanism researchers are looking at is something called visceral hyperalgesia.
Visceral. What does that mean?
Basically, think of it like this. Pain signals coming from one internal organ, say the uterus, can actually amplify the pain felt in another nearby visceral organ, like the bowel, because they share nerve pathways, kind of like crossed wires.
Huh,
And that
yeah.
low-grade inflammation we mentioned earlier, that also plays a big role in this sort of interconnectedness of symptoms.
So with all these varied symptoms and these overlaps, how is endometriosis typically diagnosed? It sounds like it could be quite a puzzle.
It definitely can be. Traditionally, the most definitive way has been surgery specifically, laparoscopy.
Keyhole surgery.
Exactly. A surgeon uses a camera to directly look inside the pelvic cavity, and they can take biopsies, little tissue samples, of anything suspicious to examine under a microscope.
But that's quite invasive.
It is. And there is a real push now towards incorporating non-invasive diagnostic tools and what are called adjunct treatments. The fact that the disease can progress and look different throughout a woman's life, from adolescence right through to perimenopause, adds another layer of challenge.
Are there any tests, like blood tests?
Currently, unfortunately, there aren't any established clinical biomarkers. Nothing we can reliably use from, say, a blood test or standard imaging alone for diagnosis, although researchers are actively looking into emerging possibilities, things like microbial markers, metabolite markers, microRNA markers, but that's still very much in the research phase.
Okay. And once someone does get a diagnosis, what are the conventional medical treatments available?
Current treatments primarily focus on managing the pain. So you have things like progestins, NSAIDs. Those are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen. Combined oral contraceptive pills are common. Then there are GnRH agonists, which are a type of hormonal therapy.
Hormonal treatments seem key.
They are. Other options include the hormonal IUD, a drug called Dianagist, sometimes aromatase inhibitors, and surgery, of course, particularly laparoscopy to remove or destroy the lesions, is a major treatment option. Robotic-assisted laparoscopy is also becoming more common.
Does treatment usually resolve it completely?
That's the challenge. A significant hurdle is that the lesions and the symptoms that go with them often recur, even after medical and surgical treatments.
Oh, right.
Plus, these treatments don't always address all the symptoms someone might have, like fatigue or the GI issues, and they don't work effectively for everyone.
So that leads people to look for other options.
Exactly. It often leads people to explore self-management strategies. And diet is a really big one that people turn to.
Which brings us right back to our main topic. The review you shared mentioned that many individuals with endometriosis find dietary changes helpful, particularly for pelvic pain and those GI symptoms.
That's a common report.
But it also pointed out there's no single magic diet that works for everyone. Why do you think that is?
Well, it likely reflects just how complex endometriosis is. It seems to have multiple underlying mechanisms driving it: inflammation, hormones, maybe the microbiome. And how it manifests, the specific symptoms, can be quite different from person to person.
So what helps one person might not hit the right target for someone else.
Precisely. What might help someone by targeting inflammation might not be as effective for someone whose main challenges relate more to, say, estrogen regulation or gut health. But the fact that so many people report benefits really underscores the potential importance of looking at diet and nutrition as supportive strategies.
Okay, let's dive deeper then into how endometriosis might develop and progress. The review really emphasizes inflammation as a major factor. What's happening there, like at a cellular level?
Yeah, inflammation is definitely considered a central player. The review highlights that various types of immune cells, think T cells, B cells, natural killer cells, are found in higher numbers and seem to be more activated, more sort of switched on in the fluid within the pelvic cavity of women with endo.
Okay.
Other immune cells like macrophages, monocytes, even mesothelial cells, they all contribute to this ongoing inflammatory environment. Think of it as the immune system being kind of on high alert in that area.
And oxidative stress, that seems linked too.
Yes, very closely linked. Researchers have found higher levels of things like iron, ferritin, and hemoglobin in that peritoneal fluid.
Iron.
Yeah. And when there's an excess of iron, it can contribute to oxidative stress. This leads to the production of unstable molecules called reactive oxygen species, or ROS.
And those cause damage.
Yeah, it can damage cells and tissues, which further fuels inflammation and might even contribute to forming adhesions where tissues kind of abnormally stick together.
The review also mentioned epigenetics and something called MTHFR gene polymorphisms. That sounds pretty technical. How does that fit in?
Right, this is where it gets really interesting, looking at the interplay between our genes and our environment. Oxidative stress, which we just talked about, can actually influence epigenetic mechanisms.
Epigenetics, like gene switches.
Kind of, yeah. Think of it as modifications to our DNA that can turn genes on or off without changing the actual genetic code itself, things like DNA methylation. And these kinds of alterations have been implicated in endometriosis.
Okay. And the MTHFR gene?
MTHFR is a gene involved in processing folate, a B vitamin. Some people have common variations or polymorphisms in this gene. One specific type, the C677T homozygous variation, might be a risk factor for endometriosis. Well, it could potentially be linked to higher levels of a compound called homocysteine, maybe from diets rich in methionine found in red meat, dairy, or issues with how the body actually processes folate itself. And nutrients involved in what's called the one-carbon cycle folic acid, B12, choline, B6, they can all influence these DNA methylation processes.
Wow. So it's this really intricate dance between genetics, diet, and cellular function.
It really is.
And you mentioned earlier that chronic inflammation can have other knock-on effects.
Absolutely. Long-term inflammation can lead to the activation of mast cells.
Mast cells, those are immune cells.
Yep. And when they get activated, they release this whole cocktail of molecules, things like prostaglandins, histamine, interleukins, leukotrienes, and something called nerve growth factor, or NGF.
What do those do?
Well, NGF can make nerve fibers more sensitive. The others activate pain receptors, cause blood vessels to widen, vasodilation, lead to swelling or edema, and contribute to that visceral pain we talked about earlier.
And where are these mast cells found?
Interestingly, they seem to be located near nerve endings, right there in the pelvic and abdominal regions, and also in the lining of the bowel, which again highlights that connection with IBS-like gut symptoms.
It keeps coming back to the gut connection.
It does. And other immune cells, like macrophages, also get drawn into the fray. They get activated by the inflammation and release even more inflammatory signals, cytokines, prostaglandins, complement components, all just perpetuating the cycle.
So inflammation is clearly a massive piece of the puzzle. What about estrogen? That was another key factor highlighted in the review.
Definitely. Endometriosis is considered a hormone-dependent condition. Estrogen and its receptors play a really significant role in its development and how it progresses.
Estrogen receptors, like docking stations on cells.
Exactly. There are two main types, viri and ero. They sit inside cells and influence gene activity when estrogen binds to them. The main estrogen involved here is 17-estradiol, or E2.
And where does that come from?
It's produced mainly in the ovaries, but importantly, it can also be produced locally within the endometriotic tissue itself, and it reaches these tissues through the bloodstream too. This accumulation of E2 is thought to be really crucial for making the lesions grow and progress by activating those estrogen receptors.
Is there anything different about these receptors in women with endometriosis?
It seems so. Normally, in the healthy uterine lining, ERI levels tend to be higher than ERI. But in women with endo, there's often a higher level of ERI expression found in their uterine lining.
And what does that mean?
Well, this increased ERI activity has been linked to more inflammation, more cell growth, less programmed cell death, apoptosis, and even the transmission of pain signals.
Wow. And ERA.
Higher ERI expression, on the other hand, has been associated with more severe pain during intercourse and more intense period pain. So it suggests that both the overall amount of estrogen circulating and the specific activity of these different receptors within the tissues contribute to how severe the symptoms are.
It also sounds like there's some interplay, some communication between estrogen and the immune system.
Absolutely. The review mentions that the very early stages might involve this kind of crosstalk between ERA and an inflammatory molecule called interleukin-6.
Okay.
And estrogen binding to ERA on those mast cells we talked about. That might actually trigger their activation, leading to the release of more inflammatory stuff. So high estrogen levels within the lesions can basically create a welcoming environment for these mast cells to gather and add to the inflammation.
And how estrogen is broken down matters too.
Yes, estrogen metabolism is important. Estradiol and estrone get converted into various metabolites through different pathways like the 2-OH, 4-OH, and 16-OH pathways. Interestingly, increased activity in that 2-OH pathway has been seen in ovarian endometriosis and linked to increased pain. It just further supports the idea that a higher estrogen environment can correlate with more severe pain.
Now, what about progesterone? Doesn't that usually balance estrogen?
It should. In healthy cycles, there's this delicate balance. But in endometriotic lesions, this balance can get disrupted. You can get what's called progesterone resistance.
Meaning progesterone doesn't work properly there.
Exactly. Even if it's present, it's not effectively counteracting estrogen's effects. So you end up with this sort of unopposed estrogen activity, which can further stimulate cell growth and inflammation, potentially making the lesions worse and increasing pain.
Okay, so we have inflammation, we have estrogen. The third key factor your review highlights is the microbiome. This is such a hot topic in health research generally. What's its potential role here?
Yeah, the microbiome, that huge community of bacteria, archaea, viruses, fungi living in and on us, especially in our gut. It's crucial for so many things: developing our immune system, defending against pathogens, helping us get nutrients from food, producing beneficial compounds like short-chain fatty acids.
Wow.
When that microbial balance gets disrupted, that's called dysbiosis, it's linked to all sorts of health issues. And importantly for this conversation, our diet massively influences the composition of our microbiome.
And the review suggests there's an emerging role specifically in endometriosis.
Yes, it's a really active area of investigation. Studies are showing that individuals with endo often have a different microbial makeup in their mouth, vagina, stool, even cervix, compared to those without the condition.
Different how?
Often, there seems to be a higher presence of potentially pathogenic or less beneficial species. For example, higher levels of bacteria like Escherichia enterococcus typidomonas have been found in the vagina. And Fusobacterium has been found in oral samples and also within the endometrium and the lesions themselves.
Is Fusobacterium causing it?
That's being explored, whether it might play a direct role. But right now, the thinking is more towards complex interactions within the whole microbial community being out of balance, rather than pinning it on one single bug.
The review also mentioned the estrobolome. That sounds intriguing.
It is. The estrobolome refers specifically to the collection of genes within your gut microbiome that are involved in metabolizing estrogens circulating in your body.
So the gut bacteria affect estrogen levels.
They can, yes. Certain gut bacteria produce enzymes called bucuronidases. These enzymes can essentially reactivate estrogen metabolites that have been processed by the liver, allowing them to be reabsorbed back into the bloodstream.
Okay.
So if you have dysbiosis, it can mess with this process. Maybe less enzyme activity could lead to lower circulating active estrogen. But conversely, if there's increased glucuronidase activity, and some research hints this might be the case in some women with endovons, it could lead to more active, unbound estrogen being reabsorbed.
Which could then fuel the endometriosis growth.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
It could contribute to that estrogen-driven proliferation we see. Think of your gut bacteria as little helpers managing estrogen levels. If the team is out of balance, it affects how much active estrogen is around.
So diet influences the microbiome, and the microbiome influences estrogen. It really shows how interconnected everything is.
Absolutely. And that interconnectedness is really the key to understanding how dietary changes might potentially help manage symptoms.
Which leads us perfectly into the next big section, dietary and nutritional interventions. The review rightly points out that, while evidence is growing, we still need more large-scale clinical trials.
Definitely. A lot of the current research is driven by patient interest and observational studies.
But what are the main ways diet and specific nutrients might be working, based on what we've just discussed?
Well, the thinking is they can potentially modulate those key pathways: inflammation, estrogen activity, and the gut microbiome.
Makes sense.
There's evidence, for instance, linking diets generally seen as pro-inflammatory, high in sugar, processed foods, unhealthy fats, to a significantly higher likelihood, maybe 4 times higher, of having endometriosis. And high red meat intake, like more than 2 servings a day, was associated in one study with a 56% higher risk.
That's substantial.
It is. And conversely, studies have found lower levels of key antioxidants like vitamin C and E and the follicular fluid, the fluid around the eggs, in women with endo. It all hints that diet could play a role not just in development, but also maybe in treatment, management, and even pain perception.
Okay, let's get into some specifics. The review mentions several dietary approaches. The low-nickel diet was one I hadn't really heard of in this context. What's the idea there?
Yeah, that one's interesting. It stems from observations that some women with endometriosis seem to have a higher rate of nickel allergy or sensitivity, and some studies found higher nickel levels in their blood.
Nickel, like in jewelry.
Well, yes, but it's also naturally present in small amounts in lots of foods: chocolate, nuts, legumes, certain grains. The hypothesis is that for sensitive individuals, dietary nickel might trigger or worsen inflammation.
Is there evidence it helps?
There was a small pilot study mentioned. Women with endo followed a low-nickel diet for 3 months, and they reported reductions in chronic pelvic pain, dysmenorrhea, and dyspareunia. It's preliminary, but suggests individual sensitivities could be relevant.
Okay. What about the FODMP diet? We hear a lot about that for IBS.
Exactly. And given that huge overlap between endo and IBS symptoms we talked about, the low FODMP diet has definitely been explored.
Remind us what FODMEs are.
A group of short-chain carbohydrates, fermentable oligo, monosaccharides, and polyols.
Yeah.
Basically, types of sugars and fibers that can be poorly absorbed in the small intestine.
And they cause gut issues.
In some people, yes. They travel to the large intestine where gut bacteria ferment them, producing gas, which can lead to bloating, discomfort, changes in bowel habits, classic IBS symptoms, but also common in endo.
So the diet might help those specific symptoms.
That's the idea. It's thought high FODMP intake might contribute to a leaky gut barrier and maybe activate those mast cells in the gut. Studies have shown that a low FODMP diet can significantly improve these gut symptoms in endo patients who also have IBS-like issues. Improvement rates of 50–80% have been reported in IBS generally.
So it targets the gut side of things mainly.
Primarily, yes, by potentially restoring the gut barrier and maybe stabilizing those gut mast cells.
Okay. And the gluten-free diet, that's another popular one.
Right. Gluten, the protein in wheat, barley, rye can trigger inflammation, obviously in celiac disease, but also potentially in non-celiac gluten sensitivity.
And the link to endo?
There's some initial evidence, mostly observational or retrospective, suggesting that going gluten-free might improve pelvic and abdominal pain for some women with endo.
Why might that be?
One theory is that gliadin, a component of gluten, might increase mast cell activity, contributing to inflammation. Some analyses where women look back reported pain improvement after cutting out wheat gluten, and symptoms sometimes returning if they reintroduced it.
But the evidence isn't clear-cut.
No, it's still quite mixed. At least one other study didn't find a link. Plus, you always need to consider potential nutritional gaps and maybe the psychological impact of a very restrictive diet like gluten-free if it's not medically necessary.
What about the Mediterranean diet, often touted as generally healthy?
Yes, and it aligns well with an anti-inflammatory approach. It's rich in things like olive oil, vegetables, fruits, whole grains, nuts, legumes, fish, poultry, and lower in red meat, sweets, animal fats.
Any specific studies on endo?
There was one single-arm trial mentioned where women following the diet reported significant improvements in pain, general pain, dyspareunia, dyschezia, dysmenorrhea.
That sounds promising.
It does, likely due to all the antioxidants, polyphenols, and anti-inflammatory compounds. But there was another study, a case control one, that found kind of different results, suggesting decreased risk was linked to red meat and green veg, and lower risk with fruit, dairy, cheese, legumes.
Contradictory.
A bit, yeah. But case control studies rely on people remembering past diets, which can be tricky, that recall bias issue. Overall, the Mediterranean pattern looks beneficial because it's inherently anti-inflammatory, but we definitely need more robust trials.
Okay. High-fiber diets, also generally recommended. Any specific relevance here?
Fiber, both soluble and insoluble from plant foods, has been looked at. One large cohort study linked higher intake of citrus fruits to a lower endo risk. But interestingly, higher intake of cruciferous veggies like broccoli to a slightly higher risk.
That's counterintuitive.
It is. And again, self-reporting bias could be a factor. Other large studies have linked higher overall fruit and veg intake to reduced risk, which feels more aligned.
How might fiber help?
Well, it might help reduce circulating estrogen levels. It could also potentially downregulate mast cell activation. Plus, fiber is crucial for a healthy, diverse gut microbiome.
Which links back to the estrobolome and estrogen metabolism.
Exactly. And generally reducing oxidative stress and inflammation.
Finally, the review mentioned a general anti-inflammatory diet. How does that differ from, say, the Mediterranean?
It's similar in principle, but maybe more explicitly focused on maximizing anti-inflammatory components. So really emphasizing a wide variety of colorful fruits and vegetables for diverse phytonutrients, fatty fish for omega-3s, lean protein, reducing refined carbs, using olive oil, and including anti-inflammatory spices like turmeric and ginger.
Is there evidence for this specific approach?
A large cohort study used something called a Dietary Inflammatory Index, basically scoring diets based on their inflammatory potential. It found that diets scoring higher, meaning more pro-inflammatory, were linked to an increased risk of endometriosis.
Okay.
And there was that Japanese study looking at women with endo who were pregnant. Those who followed an anti-inflammatory diet before pregnancy had reduced risk of preterm birth and reported better well-being. While focused on pregnancy, it suggests benefits for the underlying condition too.
It really seems like a consistent theme across these diets is tackling inflammation, influencing estrogen, maybe supporting the gut.
That seems to be the common thread, yeah.
Let's switch gears slightly to specific nutrients. The review lists quite a few. Vitamin D.
Vitamin D has garnered interest. It might decrease pelvic pain, reduce C-reactive protein, that inflammation marker, increase antioxidant capacity, modulate the immune system, maybe inhibit blood vessel growth in lesions. Lots of potential mechanisms.
What do the trials show?
One RCT showed significant pelvic pain improvement with high-dose supplementation. But another, looking at adolescents post-surgery, didn't find a statistically significant benefit versus placebo in the overall group, though there were some positive trends. So still a bit inconclusive, needs more research.
Okay. Curcumin from turmeric.
Right. A potent polyphenol known for anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects. Lab studies suggest it might suppress endometrial cell growth, possibly by reducing estrogen production, and inhibit inflammatory signals in endometriotic cells. Promising in vitro, but needs human trials.
N-acetylcysteine, or NAC.
NAC is a precursor to glutathione, a major antioxidant. There was an observational study on women with ovarian endometriomas. The NAC group saw a slight reduction in cyst size, while the untreated group saw a significant increase.
That sounds good.
It does. And they also reported less pain, dysmenorrhea, dyspareunia, chronic pelvic pain. But the big caveat is it lacked a placebo control group, which is really important for validating results.
Understood. Alpha-lipoic acid, ALA, another antioxidant.
Yep. In animal models, ALA reduced oxidative stress, implant volume, and an inflammatory marker called TNFA. Cell studies suggest it might reduce cell adhesion and invasion, again, mainly preclinical data so far.
What about combining vitamin C and E?
Since both are antioxidants, one RCT looked at them together. After 8 weeks of daily supplementation, women reported significant reductions in pelvic pain, dysmenorrhea, and dyspareunia compared to placebo. Seems targeting oxidative stress could be beneficial.
Fish oil omega-3s. We hear a lot about those for inflammation.
We do. Omega-3s work by inhibiting the conversion of arachidonic acid into pro-inflammatory eicosanoids.
Does it help endo pain?
One study showed a slight improvement in pain scores, but it wasn't significantly better than vitamin D or placebo in that particular trial. Another study suggested fish oil might be more effective than ibuprofen for severe primary dysmenorrhea period pain, not necessarily from endo. So maybe the type of pain matters. Lab studies do show omega-3s can reduce endometrial cell survival.
Okay. Folate, vitamin B9, crucial nutrient, but any specific endo link?
This one's a bit complex. A recent study flagged a potential concern. Higher dietary folate intake, especially the synthetic form, folic acid, in women with endometriosis, was linked to an increased risk of invasive ovarian cancer later on.
Oh, that sounds worrying.
It does. This link wasn't seen in women without endo. It's still being explored, but it might relate back to those MTHFR gene polymorphisms we discussed, potentially affecting folic acid metabolism and increasing oxidative stress in susceptible individuals. Needs more research, definitely.
Resveratrol, found in grapes.
Yes, another polyphenol with lots of potential anti-proliferative, anti-inflammatory, or antioxidant. Research suggests it might reduce oxidative stress, cytokine issues, and growth of endometriotic tissues. Showed positive effects in animal models.
Any human studied?
There was one small clinical trial mentioned, only 12 women. Adding resveratrol to their usual oral contraceptive significantly reduced pain compared to contraceptives alone. Small scale, but points towards potential.
And lastly, quercetin, a flavonoid.
Right, found in things like onions, apples, berries. It's an antioxidant. It might reduce inflammatory mediators like prostaglandins and leukotrienes and inhibited endometrial cell growth in mice.
Any other effects?
Combining it with metformin showed enhanced effects in lab studies. It also inhibited proliferation and invasion of cells from adenomyosis patients, a related condition. One small study showed pain improvement with a supplement containing quercetin, NAC, and turmeric. Plus, it might inhibit histamine release from mast cells.
So looking at all this, wow, the connection between endometriosis and diet is clearly complex and, as you say, still being unraveled.
Absolutely.
Your sources really highlight that while there isn't a single magic bullet diet, adopting certain dietary patterns, focusing on anti-inflammatory foods, maybe supporting gut health, and ensuring good intake of specific nutrients, it might offer some real relief for people.
Yeah, by potentially influencing those key pathways, inflammation, estrogen, the microbiome, that seems so central to the condition.
It's just fascinating how interconnected it all is. Like, thinking about how a high-fiber diet could impact both estrogen levels and mast cell activation, or how gut health feeds back into estrogen metabolism via the estrobolome.
Exactly. It really underscores why a simple, single-target approach might not work for everyone, and why looking at the whole picture is so important.
And the research we've covered also really emphasizes the need for more robust, larger scale studies, doesn't it? To develop clearer, evidence-based clinical guidelines.
Without a doubt. We need more high-quality RCTs to really understand which interventions work best, for whom, and why.
So for now, it really seems like a personalized approach is key. Considering someone's unique health profile, their specific symptoms, their lifestyle, and definitely working with healthcare professionals.
Yes, ideally practitioners who understand endometriosis and nutrition, like registered dietitians or naturopathic doctors, could be incredibly valuable in navigating these choices and creating a sustainable plan.
Well, we really hope this deep dive has provided some intriguing insights from the material you shared. It certainly gives a lot to think about and maybe some avenues to explore further with a healthcare provider.
Hopefully it's been helpful, yeah. It's a complex area, but understanding the potential role of diet is empowering.
Absolutely. And to everyone listening, please don't forget to share your feedback in the comments. Let us know what you thought and tell us what topics you'd like us to explore next.